Excellent. So welcome again to our wildlife training. This is the second wildlife training for the Envirothon. Tonight we are joined by Kerry Wixted, the Education Outreach Specialist with the Maryland Department of the Natural Resources. I'm stumbling over my words tonight. Kerry is part of our Envirothon committee and the designer of the wildlife test that you'll be taking this year and most years. So Kerry, thanks for your work with Envirothon. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you. I just want to remind everyone to pop in the chat any questions they have at any point. So Kerry, feel free to take it away.
All right, thank you, April. And I am really excited that you're here tonight. Now, it's nice to see all of these names here on a Thursday evening. So happy April too. I'm so excited that spring is just around the corner. And while I'm getting ready for my next slide, I'd like to know how many of you are new to Envirothon. So if you're new, give me a thumbs up or just type in the chat, just so I can get some information about this. All right. And if you've been around for a while, tell me how many years you've participated too. So that's also very good. So this training is the same as the last wildlife training if you attended the other one, but all of these different resource areas have different connections. So I talk a little bit about trees and things like that in the wildlife section. So it's all interconnected. All right. So I'm seeing quite a few folks that are new, which is really exciting. So welcome to Envirothon. And I guess my name again is Kerry Wixted, and I worked with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources within our Wildlife and Heritage Service. So we manage the state's wildlife resources, the ducks and the bucks and everything else in between, including little creatures like our Carolina wrens that are found here in Maryland. And so just to go over some things with our Envirothon tests, in the wildlife section, I want you to know 5 basic topic areas. And the first topic area is knowing how to identify some of our more common wildlife species. And typically you will be given field guides, and you have to use field guides on the test. It's a tool that we use out in the field all the time. I was just out today looking at wildflowers, and I had my field guides out there with me helping with identification. So knowing how to use those tools is a really important skill that we would like you to have. For this year, since it's virtual, on our Envirothon page, there are 3 PDFs that you will be using, and I'll show you a picture of one of them in a little bit. So first section is wildlife identification. The second section is all about wildlife ecology. Then we jump into conservation and management, how to age and sex white-tailed deer and wild turkey. And then finally, we will get into wildlife and society, essentially how all of these things are interconnected. And just so you know, the test is going to be broken up into those 5 main categories. And in each of the categories, you're going to have an assortment of questions. So some of those questions are going to be true or false. Some will be multiple choice. Some will include fill in the blank. And then some of them will also include short answer. So where you have to identify things and actually explain the reasoning behind your identification. So the training resources, as I said, I placed the link in the chat. So the main training resources that we want you to use this year is the Wildlife Study Guide, which is a PDF that's found on our website and also on the Maryland State Envirothon website. We have some brand new videos this year since we can't get together in person. So those videos are going to go over topics like how to age white-tailed deer, how to age and sex wild turkey, and just some of the basics of wildlife identification for the 3 main topic areas we want you to know. And those are the class aves, which include the birds, the class reptilia and amphibia, so the reptiles and amphibians, aka the herps, and then the class Mammalia, which are our mammals. So as I said on the previous slide, you will be given the wildlife identification PDFs in the test as a resource to use during the test, but you will not have access to field guides during the test. So everything you need should be in those guides. as well as some of those materials that we expect you to kind of come prepared to know in it beforehand. So we have the Maryland Wildlife Envirothon website, and then also on the Department of Natural Resources, we have the same information mirrored on that page. So you can go to either site or both of them, and you'll find that information there. All right, so let's get into our first topic area, which is wildlife identification. And this is usually a very big section of what we want you to know for an Envirothon, at least for the wildlife side. And taxonomy is the science of classification of organisms. And we like to classify organisms by placing them into different groups. And some of these groups, like kingdoms, are really broad categories. And you'll be focusing on the kingdom Animalia, or the animal kingdom, for this section of the Envirothon. And then after that, we break it down into more specialized categories, all the way down to what is known as the genus and species. And sometimes for some species, we break it down even further into the subspecies. So you should know some basics of taxonomy, how we classify these different organisms, and I'll be asking questions relating to the classifications for those organisms, which you can find in those wildlife ID guides. And also, if you're using the field guides, like in future years, when we get back in person, you'll be able to find that taxonomic information in those field guides. Something to know with the taxonomic information: if I ask a question like what order or what family that organism is found in, I would like you to write the scientific name. So for this red fox here, the order is Carnivora, or the carnivore order, and the family is Canidae, which is the dog and fox family. One really helpful tool with wildlife identification is just learning the different color patterns, the size, and habitat clues for different animals. So looking at what type of habitat you're in. Are you in a conifer forest? Are you in a bog? Are you in a grassland? That'll give you a clue to what organism might be using that. How big is the animal? And look for specific color patterns, especially around the head and the face, because a lot of times those color patterns are used for communication. So I want you to be able to use those resources that I'm providing, and also want you to understand species groupings. So how are, organisms like moles and shrews kind of similar or different from one another? And how is a mole different from a vole with a V? So those species groupings will help you select the group for the species faster, instead of just flipping through a bunch of different pages. And that'll also help you when you're looking at an organism that you don't quite know at the beginning. So it's just a great way to kind of hone in and figure out the different species that you're looking at. The next section that I want you to know is the basics of wildlife ecology. So I want you to understand habitat and how habitat can change, as well as food webs, why they're important, and how the population dynamics of different species work, as well as biodiversity. So when we think about habitat and think about a habitat occurrence, which is known as plant succession, why don't you type in the chat, what is plant succession? How would you define plant succession? You type that in the chat. So succession is one of those vocabulary terms. And this is something, plant succession is something we also look at in your forestry section. So what is succession? Feel free to type that in the chat there. Yeah, some good ones coming in. Change in species structure and how they grow and go through phases when an animal is replaced with something similar, how the structure of a plant develops over time. Order in which plants come one after another in a habitat, or change in the plant over time. Yeah. So succession is essentially the change of plant communities. When we're talking about plant succession, we're talking about the change in plant communities as we go on from in time. So, so if you have an extreme event that kind of strips all the plants down and you have bare soil, say like a volcano erupts or something like that and gets rid of all the vegetation and different plants. So stage one would be that open grounds, and then we'd get our grasses, our annual grasses coming in, and then we'll get our perennial grasses a little bit later, and that will pave the way for the shrubs, the young forests, and ultimately the climax or the old age plant communities that are found there. So typically succession is depicted in this straight line where you're going from young to old over time, but that's not exactly how it works in nature. So it isn't that straight line of development because some things happen. So sometimes you might be in stage 4 with having lots of that shrub layer in a habitat, and then all of a sudden intense windstorm comes through, and that makes some of those shrubs fall over and takes them down, and it knocks succession back. And we also alter succession with some of our habitat practices that we do, which I'll talk about in the next section with conservation management. So habitat is very important because that is where our wildlife lives. There are 4 main components of habitat. There's food, there's water, there's shelter, and there's space, and we need them in the right arrangement to be able to support our wildlife species. So understanding habitat, how it changes, and how it supports different species is an important section of the wildlife ecology place in the test. So I also want you to know about food webs and food web dynamics. So how is a food chain different from a food web? Can anybody tell me how a food chain and a food web are different? A food chain versus a food web. Think of a food chain versus a food web. What are some, how might they be different? So I see a food web's much more general. Food web is broad, includes more species and relationships between the eaten and the eaters. Nice terms. Yeah. So when we think of a food chain, we think of a linear relationship, much like when we look at succession there. And so you have these different types of energy levels, starting with our lower energy levels, our producers. And these are the organisms like plants and blue-green algae and things like that that make their own food. And then we have those organisms that eat those plants. So let's talk about some more terminology. So we have different energy levels. Does anybody know the special term for energy levels in a food chain or a food web? What are the energy levels called? Yeah, those trophic levels. Yeah, so our lowest trophic levels are our producers. And then we have those primary consumers that eat those producers. So a primary consumer eats plants. And so what's another name for something that eats plants? Herbivores. Good. See, you guys all have this. Great. So then we have our herbivores. Then we have those organisms that eats those herbivores. So some of those are omnivores and then some of them are carnivores. And then we go all the way up to our top level predators. So a food chain would be something simple like this linear relationship, taking a plant all the way up to something like our hawk. But a food web is really looking at the interrelationships because it's not that simple out in nature. There are a lot of interconnected relationships. There are a lot of more things than just a robin eating those butterflies and those moths. Similarly, there are a lot more than just the butterflies that are eating those plants. And so those food webs are much more accurate representation of what we see out in nature. And it's really important to keep those in mind, especially when we're trying to manage for different species. So understanding food webs and food web dynamics, as well as population dynamics, what causes populations to increase, what causes them to decrease, what causes them to stay the same. So understanding those dynamics is also important. And then finally, we have biodiversity, which is something we manage for on the state level. How would you define biodiversity? What's the definition of biodiversity? we define biodiversity. Good, AHS, yes. It's all of those different species within an ecosystem. So we can have different levels of biodiversity. We can have genetic biodiversity. We can have species biodiversity, and we can also have ecosystem level biodiversity. Biodiversity is very, very important. And so that is something that we focus a lot on, especially with our management techniques, which will be our next section. So wildlife conservation and management talks about different agencies that help manage our wildlife species and how we go about managing them. So if you break down management, we can break it down into two main categories. We have our population management, and then we have our habitat management. Can anybody give me examples? How would you manage a population? What are some examples of population management? So think of ways that we can manage populations. Hunting and fishing, excellent, yeah. So hunting is an extremely important management tool that we use for managing populations. You know, on the fishery side, fishing is also a management tool. What are other ways that we might be able to manage populations of our wildlife? Yeah. So I've got the picture here. This is Harry Spiker, our black bear biologist. So we do research. So to manage these populations, we have to understand the populations that we're managing. So, so this is a picture of him tagging a bear cub during our reproduction surveys, which are happening right now. And so this is one way that we track our bear population here in Maryland. So we have to be able to do population management in terms of some populations we're trying to help out and increase. And yes, we have to take some animals from one place to another. So sometimes, especially with our rare, threatened, and endangered species, sometimes we do have to work on projects that kind of help increase those populations. And on the flip side, we have populations that we're trying to decrease, like our invasive species. Some of them we are trying to remove from the state because they cause so many problems ecologically or economically. And then we have to do population level research as well. On the flip side, we have habitat management. And this is a lot of what our agency focuses on is habitat management, because you can't have wildlife if you don't have habitat. So here's an example. This is Jen Selfridge, our invertebrate zoologist. And this is, Margaret, and one of our faithful volunteers, and they're out there planting pollinator plugs. So essentially nectar and host plants for pollinators to help this grassland be able to support our local pollinators. So that's an example of habitat management. And then sometimes we also use fire, prescribed burns to manage habitats. And this helps when you think about that ecological concept of succession, this helps knock back succession and cycle nutrients. So fire can be a really important management tool. We also have to be able to research these different habitats as well. So, so habitat management also entails research, much like population management does. And our third category that I want you to know about, which also kind of fits in with that management, is learning how to age and sex whitetail deer and wild turkeys, which are two most popular game species. Now, why do you think we would really want you to be able to have those skills of being able to look at a turkey and say if it's a male or a female, and adult or juvenile, and being able to age deer? So why do you think we would care about aging and sexing wild turkey and whitetail deer? Why don't you drop it in the chat, some of your thoughts there? Population management research, gather data. Restrictions regarding those in hunting laws, yeah. Any other thoughts? When hunting is important to not kill the young or the female, yeah. So being able to age and sex these different animals is important for being able to manage them properly. And so just as Anna just mentioned, our age classes, we can actually look at age sex pyramids for different populations, not just those that are harvested like deer and turkey, or in this example, bobwhite quail. But it helps us look at what's going on in that population and if management's needed in certain areas. So if you look at something like the bobwhite quail, you'll notice there's almost a 50-50 split and that they don't live very long. And this is typically what we would expect. One thing this also shows us is that bobwhite quail are typically monogamous during the breeding season, which means one male to one female. So we would expect that they would have an almost equal split in between the sexes for the age sex pyramid. But if something happened to that population and all of a sudden we are seeing more males than females, that might be a cause for concern and something we would have to look into why we're seeing that skewed sex data. Similarly, if we look down here at our whitetail deer, you can see it's skewed much more towards the females, but this is something we would expect, because unlike quail, whitetail deer during the breeding season typically are polygamous. So that means one male is going to mate with multiple females. And in those populations that have that type of reproduction strategy, you typically see more females because you need less males. One male can mate with multiple females. So this is how we would expect that age sex pyramid to look. Similarly, and also kind of in a comparison to the bobwhite quail, typically our whitetail deer are living longer, which we would expect. And we also would expect to have more young in our populations than older individuals. So these are completely normal age sex pyramids. But if we saw something different than what we expect, then that might be a cause for concern and a reason to do some management for these different species. Perhaps there's something like a disease or a predator that might be taking out some of the younger generation and affecting recruitment in the population, which could be a cause for concern depending on your management strategies. So let's look at our wild turkey, and wild turkeys display what is known as sexual dimorphism, aka the males and the females look different. So the female wild turkeys are known as hens and the males are known as toms or gobblers. And because the females nest on the ground, they typically are much duller in color. They don't have brightly colored heads, and their breast feathers, the ones right here, are tipped in brown, are called buffy tipped breast feathers. So, and so she doesn't want to be showy, because if she's sitting on the ground on a nest or hanging out with her babies, AKA her poults, then she's going to alert predators that there's some tasty eggs or young turkeys in the midst if she looked like him. So she likes to use that camouflage as a way to try to help protect her young. So they have those buffy tipped breast feathers. They also, on their legs lack this, this modified nail called a spur, because females don't need a spur. They don't need to use it for fighting and for dominance. However, the males will have a spur on their legs. The other thing with females is when they poop, aka their scat, it's going to look like a little swirly cone out in the field. So, so they've got a totally different shaped scat than our male turkeys. So looking at our male turkey here, you can see he's much more colorful, particularly in the breeding season. His head gets bright red, white, and blue. So really, really showy, almost iridescent feathers. If you were to look at the tip of his breast feathers, you would see that they're tipped in black. So they're black tipped feathers on the males. They have the J-shaped scat. So juvenile male turkeys are known as jakes. So I always say J for Jake to help me remember the differences in male versus female wild turkey scat. And then on the male turkeys, they have that spur on their legs. As the turkey ages, that spur gets longer and more pointed. So a juvenile male turkey, aka a jake, is going to have a rounded spur on his leg, but an adult male is going to have a pointed spur like you see here in the picture. So that's how you age and sex wild turkeys. Moving along to our white-tailed deer, we actually age white-tailed deer by looking at their jawbones. And so they have baby teeth just like us, and we can look at their baby teeth versus adult teeth, essentially the wear and replacement on their teeth, to kind of age them into different age classes. And we have 4 main age classifications for whitetail deer. We have our 6-month, we have our 17-month, our 18-month, and 2.5-year plus. So does anybody know the first thing that you want to do when you're looking at a whitetail deer jawbone? So what is the first step that you would do for aging? You can type that in the chat. What is your first step if you've done this before? And while I'm waiting for those responses to come in, we're looking at the lower jawbone that's found on the deer, and we're looking at the cheek teeth, the ones in the back, not the ones in the front. The incisors are used for clipping plant material. Those aren't the ones that count. It's the ones on the side that are doing the crushing and the grinding of the plant material. And Oliver, you're completely correct. So the first thing we want to do is count the teeth. And we count from front to back. So, from front to back. And if you have less than 6 cheek teeth, so again, we're looking at those premolars and those molars, those crushing grinding teeth, less than 6 cheek teeth, you've got a deer that's 6 months or less. So that is in the fawn classification there. So if you have all 6 teeth, the next thing you want to do is count to the 3rd tooth. So 1, 2, 3. And you want to look at this 3rd tooth, this 3rd premolar, and you want to see if it has 3 main ridges on it. 1, 2, 3, or 2 main ridges. 1, 2. Okay. You've got all 6 teeth on one side and a tricuspid 3rd premolar. Then that's a baby tooth, and that means you have a 17-month-old deer or a 1.5-year-old deer, okay? Then around 18 months, they're actually going to lose that tricuspid baby tooth, and it's going to be replaced with a bicuspid or 2-cusped adult tooth. So if you look at this, there's 1 ridge there and 2 ridge, so bicuspid, okay? This tooth sometimes is only going to be partially erupted in the jawbone, so it's not going to be as flush with the rest of the other teeth. You can kind of see that on just in this image, just to give you an idea. This tooth right here isn't fully erupted, but this one is. So if you see, a partially erupted bicuspid here, that could be an 18-month-old deer. If it's fully erupted, what you want to look at is right at the top of the tooth, okay? Right where it grinds plant material down. If it lacks denting, which is wear on the enamel, then that is an 18-month-old deer. So when I say denting, I don't need all this brown stuff right here along the sides of the teeth. That's all plaque because whitetail deer can't brush their teeth. And this is how your teeth would look if you weren't brushing your teeth. You'd have all that brown gunk on the sides. When I talk about denting, I'm talking about this brown stripe right there, right on the grinding surface at the top of the tooth. It's a brown stripe where the enamel wears away. So if you have a bicuspid tooth with little to no wear, like this one right here, there's no brown stripe from that denting, then you've got an 18-month-old deer. But if you have a bicuspid tooth that does show that wear, that denting like this, that brown stripe, then you have at least a 2.5-year or older deer. So we call it 2.5 plus. After 2.5 years, it gets really hard to reliably age a whitetail deer. So we only focus on those 4 categories for our aging whitetail deer. And this is a skill that our biologists use every fall when hunters bring in their deer to different butcher shops around the state. We're out there aging the whitetail deer and looking at that to create our own idea of the age sex structure of the population. So moving along to our last category, wildlife and society. And in wildlife and society, you'll be looking at different concepts like native, invasive, and rare species. You'll be looking at wildlife diseases, and you'll be looking at legislation, major wildlife legislation that affects our wildlife. So what is an invasive species? Can anybody define what an invasive species is? Why don't you type in the chat? What is an invasive species? see, not native and problematic, harmful and non-native. Non-native, detrimental to other populations. Something does not belong to a certain area. Yeah. So invasive species, by definition, by the federal definition, are non-native species that cause economic, environmental, and/or human health-related harm. So they're essentially non-native species that cause problems. And so, so these species have been sometimes brought from other regions of the United States or other countries, and sometimes halfway across the world. So essentially, they aren't native to whatever area that they're found in, and they're causing problems. Not all non-native species are invasive, but all invasive species are non-native. It's an important concept to know. So right here is a classic example of an invasive species in Maryland. This is a Nutria, which is a rodent from South America that was introduced on the Eastern Shore. And so what they do is they destroy wetland vegetation and have caused a lot of loss of wetlands on our Eastern Shore here in the state. Then we have different types of wildlife diseases. And so, so I'll be looking for, your knowledge about some of the major diseases that affect our wildlife. Anybody know what disease typically affects these cold-blooded animals like our frogs and other types of amphibians? You get lesions and things like that. A disease, wildlife disease that affects our cold-blooded wildlife like amphibians. And our reptiles too. So even things like box turtles can get to them. Salmonella is a concern, so they can be carriers of salmonella. There's another disease that I'm looking for. And this disease is found in the Wildlife Study Guide, so we talk about it too in there. So the disease is called Rhonovirus. Think of Rana for frog. And so, so yeah, and chytrid fungus is another problematic disease for these species. So rhonovirus is a disease of cold-blooded organisms. It can affect fish, but it mainly hits a lot of our amphibians and certain species of reptiles like our eastern box turtles. So understanding some of these wildlife diseases, chronic wasting disease, white nose syndrome, rhonovirus, and all of that is part of this wildlife and society section. And then finally, we want you to know some major pieces of wildlife legislation that affect our wildlife, both on the national and on the state scale. So for example, all of our seals and other marine mammals are protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So it's not legal to harass, capture, and/or kill things like seals and whales and other types of marine mammals. So let's practice. Let's go through some examples of different types of questions, and you're welcome to have your wildlife ID guides and your notes with you. So if you have any of that stuff here, or you can just try your best with your memory. So we're going to look at a couple different animals and some other questions just to give you an idea of things that I'm looking for. So first thing I want you to do is I want you to look at this critter right here. So look at this critter and tell me, what is the name for the top part of a turtle's shell? What is the name for the top part? So this part right here, what's the name for it? Got to vote for carapace from Serena. More votes for carapace. Exactly right. So the top part of the turtle shell is called a carapace, and the bottom part is called the plastron. And then they have these scales called scutes. So, so those are the scutes there. What about what order is this reptile in? What is the order? So this is that taxonomy that I want you to know. Can anybody tell me what order this is and/or what is the common name for this animal? What's the order? Then I'm looking for the scientific order. And this would be the order for turtles. Oh, I got to vote for the common name. It's a bog turtle. So it's in, I was going to look up the pronunciation, Testudines or Testudines. So this is the order for turtles, and you will find that in your reptile ID guide, that PDF there. And then Aaron says this is a bog turtle, which it is. What tipped you off? What tips you off that this is a bog turtle? Can you explain your reason for identification? And anybody else can jump in. What kind of gives you a clue? Yep, that orange on the neck. So this is a tiny turtle. It's a federally threatened species that you can find in places like Baltimore and Harford County here in Maryland, and it lives in a very specialized habitat called a fen. It has that orange spot on its head and mostly dark colored carapace or top part of its shell. And they're very small, so they don't get very large. And unfortunately, they're threatened by illegal collection. So let's look at this turkey. What's the sex of this turkey? Male or female? Male or female? See a vote for male? Young male, and tell me why. Ooh, we got one for female. So what are some things that we should look at? We have to look at the head. So the head's kind of colorful. Then we look down here at these breast feathers. And what color are the tips of the breast feathers? So look at the color of those breast feathers there. Look at the tips right here. Those are brown. Yeah, so these are nice buffy tips. And then if we look at the legs, there's no bump, so no spur. So Matola, you are correct. This is a female, even though she's kind of shiny up here and she's got that color right. So essentially, this is a female. So this is an example of something that I might ask, just so you know your field identification. Good. All right, let's age this deer. How old is this deer right here? Got a buck, which is a male deer. It's got some big antlers there. Give me some of your guesses. $18 months to 2.5 plus. Any other guesses for how old this deer is? This actually is a trick question. So I'm going to stop sharing and spotlight my video. All right, so hopefully you can see this. So you cannot reliably age a whitetail deer by its antlers because antlers fall off and, you know, females typically don't have antlers. There's a select few that do. So we have to look at the jawbone, and this is the lower jawbone here. If this was intact, this is where the incisors would be. And these are all the cheek teeth right here. So what's our first step for aging a deer jawbone? What's the first thing you want to do when you're looking at a jawbone for a whitetail deer? Count the teeth, right? So we're going to count the teeth. So we got 1 tooth right here, got 2 teeth, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we've got 6 teeth. What's our next step? What's the next step we have to do after we count the number of teeth? We got to look at the third tooth, right? And so we know we've got 6 teeth, so we know this is not a 6-month-old deer. So we're gonna look at the third tooth. So this is 1 tooth, this is 2, And this is number 3, okay? And look at this tooth. So look at this. Would you call this a bicuspid or tricuspid? And this is the hard part for people who are new, especially since you're looking at this virtually and not with a jawbone in your hand. So look at this right here. Is this a bicuspid or tri? Good, good. I'm seeing bicuspid. Yeah. So so it's got 2 main ridges. So 1, 2 right here. And if it's a bicuspid, what's the next step? Or do we have an age on this deer? We got 6 teeth and a bicuspid, 3rd premolar. What's our next step? We got to look for wear, right? Because if it has a bicuspid, we know this is an adult tooth, okay? So if we got to look for wear, let's look right here. This again is a little hard to show you on a computer, but you see this brown stripe right in here, right on the top. It's like white, brown, white. That is denting, and that is essentially where the enamel wears away and the inside of the tooth is exposed there. So so it's a little different than the crud, like right there. That's like old corn and stuff. But right in here, right on this tip, you can actually see where it's shiny and there it has wear. So this has 6 teeth. It has a bicuspid 3rd premolar, and it's got wear. So how old is this deer? How old would this deer be? 2.5 plus. Good, good. So so yeah, and then if you look at some of these other teeth, just to give you an idea of that dentin, you'll see that brown stripe right there, that white, brown, white, like a little sandwich. That is what you're going to be looking for on this 3rd tooth here, okay? If it is an older deer, an older tooth. So just to give you a heads up, on 17-month-old deer, their baby tooth, which is the tricuspid right here, the enamel is really thin, so it wears really fast. And the same thing happens with humans. So younger kids, with their baby teeth, they get a lot more cavities than adults do. And that's just because as baby teeth, they have very thin enamel. So if you see a lot of wear, make sure you're looking to see first if it's a bicuspid like you see here or a tricuspid. Because sometimes that catches students when they're looking at the jawbones. They see a lot of wear and they automatically think it's an old deer, but that baby tooth could be worn down really quickly. All right. So I'll get it on my pin, pull up my screen. All right, so there's your aging question. So you'll have to be able to age and explain your reasoning. So next question we have is this bird right here. What family is this bird in? What family is this bird in? So we got what family is this bird in? We have what's the common name? And what piece of wildlife legislation protects birds like this one? Got to vote for pick a day. So what's the family? What family is this bird in? What's the common name? And what piece of wildlife legislation protects birds like this one? Is Pickaday. So Serena's correct. The Pickaday is the woodpecker family. So woodpeckers have those chisel-like bills. And a lot of them are black and white, but not all of them. So they've got this kind of appearance. They have these special type feet called zygodactyl, where 2 go up front and then 2 kind of go behind. Can't really demonstrate it very well with my fingers, but they have zygodactyl feet to allow them to crawl up and down tree trunks and other surfaces to get to delicious insects. So the common name of the species is actually the hairy woodpecker. And so that's because this is the bigger of the two species. And it's got the larger bill. So that's one of the differences. And then if you were to also look at the tail feathers, this is one that's a little harder because they don't always fan out their tails, but it doesn't have spots on the tail feathers there. So this is also a male. So both the hairy and the downy woodpeckers, the males have a patch of red on their head and the females do not. So you will see that sexual dimorphism in some of our woodpecker species here in Maryland. What about what piece of wildlife legislation protects birds like this one? What species, what piece of wildlife legislation is going to protect them? So this is that wildlife and society there. What piece of wildlife legislation protects birds like this one? Any guesses? It's called the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So it's Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. And it is an international agreement with the United States and Canada and Mexico. And essentially it protects bird species, any native migratory bird species here in the United States and also in some of the areas that they migrate to. So, all right. So it's really quick, true or false? True or false? 2 species in the Cervidae deer family, aka the deer family, can be found in Maryland. True or false? 2 species in the Cervidae family can be found in Maryland. 2 cervids can be found in Maryland. True or false? Got 2 choices. Any guesses, true or false? 2 species in the Cervidae family can be found in Maryland. Got true, true. It is true. Good. Those are the Sika deer, which are actually introduced elk species, and that's the whitetail deer. So true or false? The cottonmouth is a venomous snake found in Maryland. True or false? The cottonmouth is a venomous snake found in Maryland. Got some votes for false. Good. So that is false. Those the only 2 venomous species that we have here in Maryland, at least medically significant venomous species, are the copperhead and the timber rattlesnake. So the cottonmouth is not part of Maryland's fauna. What about the Atlantic flyway is a major migration route for Canada geese? True or false? The Atlantic flyway is a major migration route for Canada geese. The Atlantic flyway is a major migration route for Canada geese. That is true. Good job, Anna. So flyways are the typical major migration routes for certain species of birds. And here along the Atlantic coast, most of our bird species are using that Atlantic flyway. There's also a Central flyway and Mississippi flyway, but most of our birds are using that Atlantic flyway. And last one, true or false, trapping is an important wildlife management tool. Trapping is an important wildlife management tool. What do you think, true or false? Got to vote for true, and it's true. Hunting and trapping are 2 very important wildlife management tools. So very, very important. Good job. All right, last example question. Okay, so during the last century, human impacts on our environment, on our planet, have led to an increasing and alarming loss of biodiversity. Scientists estimate that the current extinction rates exceed those of prehistoric mass extinctions. Loss of biodiversity also means loss of genetic diversity and loss of ecosystem diversity. What's the major cause for biodiversity loss in Maryland? Is it habitat destruction, alteration, and fragmentation, the spread of invasive species, pollution, illegal collection, or climate change? A, B, C, D, or E? What's the major cause for biodiversity loss? Got to vote for C. And the rest are A. And A is correct. So habitat loss is the #1 threat to biodiversity here in Maryland and in other areas of the world. Good. So that is your introduction to our wildlife section, and just give you an idea of some of the flavor of questions that I'll be asking during the test. And I'm posting in the chat those resources again, so please check out our website. So check out that study guide and be familiar with the content in the study guide. Check out those wildlife ID PDFs and make sure you know how to use them before we get to the tests. And that way it's easier for you to maneuver through them and use them to your advantage to answer some of those questions. And be familiar with those aging and sexing techniques for white-tailed deer and wild turkey. So we'll open the floor up to any questions that you might have, and thank you for joining in. So if anybody has any questions, you can type in the chat. I think, go ahead. I've stumped you all. Yes, the Google slide guides were what you'll be using on the test this year. So typically you would have those field guides, and you'd have to know how to use the field guides and find species using range maps that are found in Maryland. But we just don't have ability for everybody to have access to the field guides during the test. So we've made those PDFs that are going to be available both before the test, so they're up right now, and then also during the test.
Yeah, the resources that you need will be embedded right into the test program, so that you don't have to have the links available to you. They will be made available that you click it and it'll open in a side window or background tab. So you won't even have to leave or have it ready. So the test this year will be hosted through the UMD ELMS platform. There will be every participant will be able to access the tests, though we are gonna just ask that the team captain be the only one to submit the tests. Each day, one of the subjects will be there. I believe you've gotten the schedule Wildlife Wednesday, for example. The test will be available from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Once you begin, you have 2 hours to complete. And most of the testing segments or subject areas will have smaller segments within them. So wildlife, for instance, will have 5 different sections, each with their own sub-time limit. You can use the entire time, you can use a portion of the time, it's really up to you. But once you submit that section, that will be the last you can't go back and edit it, you can't attempt again. That's kind of, you submit and you move on. Most of the subject areas you can do any of the sections in any order. So for instance, if you want to do ID before you do the policy and the law side of things, you could do that. But we do ask that all teams stay on the same section at the same time, or excuse me, all members of the team, not all teams. We will be releasing some more guidelines as we get closer about the actual way the exam should be administered and how you should work with your teams. But we are, in theory, going to allow you to meet either virtually or in person, depending on what your school district allows, to be able to work on the test together. But more guidelines will be sent out as soon as we have them available. We're kind of finalizing some details because we know every school district is a little different. And then there are some teams that aren't school-based, they're club-based. So we want to be able to provide options and opportunities that meet with everyone's needs. But you will still have the opportunity to work together and submit one test as a team.
And I'm not sure how many questions I have total, but it's going to be split into those 5 sections. So, and you'll have, again, 2 hours to complete those 5 sections.
The tests are about the same length as they are if you were to be in person. We're just providing additional time to complete them because we're in online format. So like, for instance, aquatics has about 12 to 15 questions in 4 different sections. But there's some ID, there's some using keys, there's some true, false, fill in the blank. There's a variety of types of questions.
Yeah, I think most of the sections for wildlife are around like close to 10 questions per section, but not all. Some of them are, you know, like wildlife identification, they're less questions, but the questions are worth more. Good question. Identifying species or aging. So aging wild turkey is usually pretty straightforward because you're looking at the legs and or the tail fans. I forgot to mention the tail fans, but that's also in the video and the training document there. So for whitetail deer, I think one of the things that I see people get caught up on is looking at that 3rd premolar and the tricuspid and seeing a lot of wear and just thinking that it's an old deer without noticing that it's a tricuspid or a baby tooth. And then sometimes just looking at those 18-month-old teeth can also be a little deceiving if you're not used to looking at them, looking for wear. So you'll have pictures of jawbones, both from the top and the side, and they'll have those features that you'll have to look for on the jawbones and all of that. In terms of identifying species, it's really species dependent. So in those ID guides, pay attention to the arrows that are pointing to major things to look at. And also in the descriptions, it tells you sort of those identifying features. Excuse me. And I tried to model them after the field guides, which also have that. So under the names for those different species, they have the major things to look for and those arrows. So just paying attention to that and not just simply looking at the color or saying that it matches without looking at the actual information. Welcome.
Great. Since we are now at 7 o'clock and there doesn't seem to be any more questions in the chat, I am going to thank Kerry for being here and presenting with us tonight and for sharing all that information. Again, in the chat is a whole bunch of resources and links to the wildlife study guides. They're also available on the Maryland Envirothon website, and it links straight to the DNR page that also has them. So you can get all of that by visiting the website. Again, we'll be sending more information out as the contest gets closer. So please be a look on that. Coaches and team members will receive them. And then these videos will be available on the website and YouTube by the 12th at the latest. So thank you all for joining us. Happy spring break to those of you who are on spring break, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
All right, thank you all and good luck. I hope you enjoy Envirothon this year. I know it's a little different flavor than in other years, but I'm very glad that you came to join us tonight, and good luck. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you enjoy learning about the different resources and the topic areas and all of that. and hope you consider continuing on with Envirothon. And I always suggest play to the strengths of your team too. So utilize the different knowledge, collective knowledge in your teamwork, because teamwork makes dream work, right? So have a
That's why it's a
fantastic
team
weekend.
competition.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Thank you all for coming. Have a great night.